Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Bill Lafayette, a member of the CMC Board of Trustees and founder and owner of Regionomics. It's great to see everybody here today. Our forum today, European Union Trading Partner Friend, is supported by the Ohio State University and the Columbus Regional Airport Authority, and is presented in partnership with the Columbus Council on World Affairs. Please join me in thanking our sponsors and partners for their support. Now, please help me welcome Anil Makija, the new Dean of the Fisher School of Business, to the stage to introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you all for coming today. It is my pleasure to be here today representing the Ohio State University and the Fisher College of Business as we support the mission of the Columbus Metropolitan Club to engage people and ideas in community conversation. Today we will learn, some of you for the first time perhaps, about a major new trade initiative, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, or the TTIP, between nations of the European Union and the United States. While there is much work to be done in TTIP, negotiations are expected to continue through 2015, the potential for easing trade barriers and increasing commerce in both directions across the Atlantic holds great promise and potential opportunity, including here in Ohio. Allow me to introduce our speakers today. Martin Steger is the director and leader of the global business practice at Kegler, Brown, Hill, and Ritter. Next to me here is Kenny McDonald, is the Chief Economic Officer at Columbus 2020. And we also have with us Tim Sword. He is the new president of the Columbus Sister Cities International. Tim will provide, Tim will provide a short overview of our topic today and then join Martin and Kenny for conversation. Tim, the podium is yours. Let's provide a warm welcome for all our speakers for the day.
All right. Thank you, Anil. So let's set the stage. Currently, the U.S. has free trade agreements with 20 different nations. And in 2011, after a long process, we established free trade agreements with Panama, Colombia, and South Korea. Today, we're discussing the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, which is a proposed free trade agreement between the United States and the European Union. The Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, or otherwise known as TTIP, is an ambitious, comprehensive, and high-standard trade investment agreement between negotiating countries of the United States and the EU. According to the U.S. Office of the International Trade Representative, TTIP will help unlock opportunity for American family workers, businesses, farmers, and ranchers throughout the country by increasing access to the European markets for made-in-America goods and services, and this will help promote U.S. international competitiveness, growth, and jobs. The U.S. and the EU economies are two of the most modern, most developed, and most committed to high standards of consumer protection in the world. TTIP aims to bolster that already strong relationship in a way that will help boost American growth and to add to more than 13 million American and EU jobs that are already supported by transatlantic investment. TTIP will be a cutting-edge agreement aimed at providing greater compatibility and transparency in trade and investment regulation while maintaining high levels of health, safety, and environmental protection. It's an extraordinary opportunity to bond the two, the EU and the United States. But this is similar. There's positive reactions not only from our official administration, but also by citizens and policymakers on both sides of the Atlantic. But however, if you do any investigation, you're going to find out that this agreement is not without skepticism and controversy. Much of the concerns relates to the increased corporate power and tying the hands of governments in maintaining their own regulatory markets. Today, I'm joined by two local leaders focusing on forging international connections that benefit our community and here in Columbus. And together, they share many, many years of experience in doing this kind of work, and I want to thank them for being part of this conversation. So, Martijn, what is the current state of the TTIP negotiations between the U.S. and the EU?
Tim, thank you. We are in the 8th round. It just finished in early February, and they're in the process of setting the 9th round of negotiations for over the next couple of months. It sounds like with those numbers, we ought to be fairly far advanced, and yet it might be useful to know that the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which has been negotiated for much longer than TTIP, went through about 19 rounds of negotiation. So I think it's accurate to say that the expectations that have been set by our government are a 2015 close to negotiations. I think the likely reality is longer than that. The wild card might be President Putin. More on that later.
Okay. So, how did these negotiations take place? I mean, I haven't, to be honest with you, heard a lot in the news about it over the last couple of years. So, where are these negotiations taking place and between whom?
They're taking place primarily in Brussels and Washington between our U.S. Trade Representative and the EU Trade Commissioner. We have a relatively new EU Trade Commissioner now who took office last year, and that actually has spurred hopes for more progress in the negotiations.
Okay. So, Kenny, is this negotiation, I mean, is this important to our region? What is Columbus 2020 already doing to promote investment and trade with the EU?
Well, first of all, it's huge. The scale of the agreement is dwarfs NAFTA, and as we were discussing earlier, we can all recall the immense amount of debate that we had around NAFTA. This is multiple times that with the two biggest economies in the world, and so it matters to large companies, small companies, and communities all across our country that are going to be impacted by whatever agreement we come to or don't come to. We have a strong belief that trade leads to jobs. And with our Columbus Global Connect program, when our companies export, they add jobs here at home. And they add good jobs at home, those jobs that have higher wages. And so we're firmly behind helping our companies go global and to export even more around the world. And these trade agreements generally accelerate that and make that job a little bit easier. We also believe that the relationships built from trade lead to investment and lead to direct investment in our communities from those companies that are coming to our market. And Europe is still our largest partner. The transatlantic trade is enormous and increasingly important and historically important. We'll be there. We're there probably 4 times a year talking to companies from across the EU who are considering our market, and the harmonization of the rules and regulations between our market and theirs is always a topic of conversation when we're in their conference rooms about how to do these deals. It's important for Ohio. Ohio is the number 9 export state in the country. Our region alone has $11 billion of exports of product and services around the world. That was a 2012 number, and I expect that number to be even larger when we look back at the last few years. And then finally, it's important to our customers. So it's important to the companies that operate here, many of which, hundreds of which are exporting their goods and services to those markets. And it's a topic of conversation. If it isn't, it probably should be a topic of importance to them and their board of directors and things like that. And it's important to the customers we have that are seeking our market. over half of which now are foreign companies looking to do business in our market. Both Martin and I were just at the Select USA Summit, sponsored by the U.S. Department of Commerce. There were over 1,600 foreign firms at that conference, and every state was there promoting their wares to those companies about a place to invest. These trade agreements, and TTIP in particular maybe, is a topic of conversation and something that we need to be very mindful of and pay close attention to for our economy.
Martin, Kenny said that this dwarfs NAFTA. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. The U.S. and Europe together account for about 50% of global GDP. So it really does dwarf NAFTA in terms of all the numbers across the board, in terms of the potential impact on jobs, the potential impact on increasing exports as well.
I'm not sure where you were during this time, but I was a student at Ohio State University, and that's when NAFTA was going on, and it was in the news. I mean, it was a big deal, and it seemed like it was much more in the American consciousness than this agreement is. If it's so much more significant, why do you think we're not hearing as much about it?
That's a great question, and quite frankly, I haven't figured out the answer to it, because I think we should be more focused on it. I think the kind of issues that are involved in it will impact our businesses, our personal lives, and so we should be focused on it. One reason might have been, and this is just a guess, that we had a presidential election involving a third-party candidate, Ross Perot. For those of you who have gray hair like me, you'll remember Ross Perot. And he coined a phrase which stuck in the public consciousness. He said that NAFTA will result in a great sucking sound. And what he meant by that is that jobs would be sucked out of the U.S. down to Mexico. The good news is that isn't what happened. Now, I think the balanced views that I have read, the studies that I've read about NAFTA showed that it did accelerate global trade dramatically in its first 6 years or so of following on the passage of NAFTA, the implementation of it beginning in '92. But then it slowed down a bit. And I think those who said, like Ross Perot, that it would be a disaster for jobs in the U.S., I believe turned out to be wrong. We have lost jobs. Some of them might have been because of NAFTA, but I think the net was a really dramatic increase in jobs. And some of those jobs we might have lost anyway to other factors, like automation, for example.
You know, the challenging part of communicating that is it's clearly easy to identify jobs that were lost because of these kind of agreements or because of increased trade. There's no doubt about it. And unfortunately, sometimes those job losses are in big numbers, like 50 jobs or 100 jobs, where the job creation is 1, 2 at a time. It's spread out throughout the company. And it's not as easy to measure. It's not a big story that, oh, this company came out with 150 new jobs because of this agreement. But if you look over time, it does seem that that's the case. Would you agree?
I do agree with that.
So what do we need to do to communicate
focuses
that?
on that actually every day. He and his team do.
So what do we need, Kenny, to do in order to promote this?
Well, I think we need to look at the entire picture. I would say that I think language matters a lot, right? So if we talk about trade policy and we talk about TTIP and things like that, a lot of people shut down and feel that they're not part of that conversation. But when you talk about jobs and you talk about what would happen in your community, I think bringing that and making that more real in rooms like this and having these kinds of dialogues is really critical. And talking in plain English about it, at least our version on this side of the Transatlantic agreement, our English about it. And we can't, we got to have topics like this. We got to bring it home and bring real stories to the table. How is it actually going to fix some of the small businesses that are right here in our backyard? How is it going to affect our corporate giants that are also operating here? Companies like great foreign investors that we already have, like Honda and Siemens. How does it impact them? What is their view of this? What is the view of our companies who are trying to enter those markets? We have great companies like L Brands who are doing business and entering those markets, Abercrombie and Fitch and others that are major employers here. What's their view of this? I think it's critical that we have those conversations and also get it down to the worker level and get the opinion of unions and everybody else as part of the conversation, because it's not an easy discussion sometimes. I will finally say that although it increases competition, I think that probably at the end of the day, that competition leads to more innovation, which is the heart of the U.S. economy. It'll bring people to our market. It'll allow our competitive companies to go to their markets a little easier. And I think I would bet every day on the United States winning that battle overall.
So last week I was actually in Europe with 10 students from Ohio State University. We were focused on sustainability, and we were in Denmark. We went to the Greater Columbus sister city of Odense and also to Copenhagen. And while we were in Copenhagen, we visited with the business school there, which Ohio State has an exchange program with. And talking to the program manager on their side, he said, you know, it seems like in the last 5 years, Americans have definitely gone inward. Less students seem to be as actively pursuing this comparative to their students, and that the conversation from his perspective is that maybe we are closing back in. And I'm just curious, do you guys agree with that opinion, or are you in a position to even address that because of what you focus on?
Yeah, that's an interesting view. I'm actually a little bit surprised to hear that because although I can tell you that historically, my relatives are primarily in the Netherlands, and they've believed for as long as I can remember talking with them about politics that they should actually have a vote in the U.S. presidential election. Because seriously, they say that the U.S. president, and they haven't extended it to Congress, but if I asked, I'm sure they would. But the U.S. president has more impact on their lives than the Dutch prime minister. So it's interesting for me to hear the perspective that there's maybe a retrenchment and a focus more on Europe. I don't know, could that be driven by the fact that Europe is living on the border of, with Russia, and that there's and the Middle East? I mean, it's not very far from Italy to Tunisia, for example. So maybe because of what's happening in the neighborhood of Europe, maybe that's driving more of an insular view. But when it comes to trade, that's not what we see with our clients. We see a lot of connectivity, a lot of concern about how to better facilitate trade between the U.S. and Europe.
Martin, let's go back to the TTIP and the fact that we mentioned that it was controversial. Can you explain what the polarization is in regards to it, both here and specifically in Europe?
Sure. There is more attention being paid to it in Europe than here so far. I hope that changes because, like Kenny, I'd like to see engagement by members of the public, by unions, by trade associations. And I think a couple of things have been driving it in Europe. Our colleague Katja Garvey, who grew up in Germany, went to law school in Germany, and then came here. She's heading over to Germany for several months, and one of the first things she's doing is going to a TTIP program there. And the German Green Party in particular has been raising serious concerns about environmental issues, GMO. I think all of you have probably followed the GMO debate. Here, we're a lot more comfortable with genetically modified organisms in our food products. In Europe, it's almost anathema.
So the first time I went to Europe for the state of Ohio was to Anuga, which is the largest food show in the world in Germany, in Cologne. And I was representing some Ohio companies, and the very first question they'll ask, is this GMO free? I mean, that is the first question. I mean, it was so, and that was in 2001, and it's not abated at all.
And that's a great point, Tim, because that then has fed into the TTIP debate in Europe. When you talk with people in Europe about why are they already focused on TTIP when we might not even be halfway through the process, it's because they're thinking about things like, we in Europe have decided we don't want GMO in our food products, and the fear is that with the TTIP passage sometime in the next few years, they may lose control over making those kind of decisions about their food security and their food safety. And it is a topic in the negotiations. I think there's one other issue that has been a hot button, and that's called ISDS, the Investor State Dispute Settlement Mechanism. And I'll take just a minute to lay that out because it sounds academic and legalistic.
Aren't you a lawyer?
I am a lawyer, so so I do think about legal things every now and then. But it actually is really important because the debate in Europe has been ISDS is a mechanism for resolution of disputes that would arise under any past TTIP, and it will take power away from the local courts. And they're, you know, that power, that loss of power, feels threatening. The truth is that it will take power away from the local courts. It is a dispute resolution mechanism. It's essentially a type of arbitration. And the fear is that it'll be corporate lawyers like me sitting in rooms with closed doors making decisions about the fate of you know, everyday citizens. It's an interesting fear, and we ought to have a debate about that. The irony is that if you look back historically for hundreds of years, there are something like 1,400 trade treaties amongst European countries, multilateral, bilateral, within and outside Europe, that have ISDS provisions in them. They're not. It's not like it's some new, you know, snake that has slithered into the room. It's a part of many, many treaties. But the reason I believe that it's a serious part of the debate is there have been a couple of celebrated cases, and I'll just mention them real quickly here, that have captured the public's attention in Europe. One is, after the Fukushima disaster in Japan, Germany decided to phase out nuclear power. Under one trade treaty within Europe, a Swedish company, a power company that has a number of nuclear power plants in Germany, has sued under the relevant ISDS provision to gain compensation for expropriation, arguing that the German government's decision to phase out nuclear power is going to take away the property, the profits in this case, that would otherwise come from operating those nuclear power plants. That's a big issue. Another one is that Philip Morris has sued the Australian government over its requirement that there be grisly pictures of lung cancer victims on cigarette packages. And so the fear is that those kind of decisions that really have a direct impact on our lives as citizens will get decided by forums that seem, you know, behind closed doors and outside of the control of ordinary citizens. And what I'd say about that is take those examples and spend some time, you know, read the provisions, debate about it. We need engagement on that. Sure. I don't think either position is an unalloyed good or bad, but we need to be engaged in it.
Kenny, are you a lawyer?
I am not.
What did Martijn just say? So what did we just hear from Martijn about investments? What can you talk about investments and the opportunities for TTIP?
Well, maybe a couple things. I will tell you that a firm agreement and an enforceable agreement would also solidify people's thinking about how they're going to do trade and investment, and that would accelerate trade and investment between the two entities, and that's critically important. It's frustrating when we work really hard to go find someone who would be interested in the U.S. market, but they are holding back, if you will, hoping or maybe expecting that this is going to be resolved. And if it was firm and they knew what to expect, they could go ahead with their investment. And likewise for our companies doing business in the EU, right? And the more trade and investment we have, the more we can accelerate that, the more relationships we build. And quite frankly, both economies should expand based on that. And it should shore us up against some of the emerging markets around the world. So while Europe probably has more to gain from this than we do at the end of the day, because they have fairly flat markets and we have the growing market, it does make both stronger against places elsewhere in the world that have huge populations and are beginning to compete with us on an everyday basis. That's India and China and others. And then finally, you know, I think it'll definitely come up when we're talking to small and mid-sized businesses. When we're in their offices a few weeks from now, when we're going to, we'll be in the Netherlands, we'll be in the UK, we'll be in Germany, and we'll be in Italy. And these are all small, mid-sized companies thinking about across a whole bunch of industries. I guarantee you it will come up, and they'll want to know our opinion about what we think, or maybe even how our delegation views it. And it's you have some interesting bedfellows on the topic too. So you have general agreement. I think the White House has wants to proceed with trade agreements. Good chunk of Congress on both sides of the aisle does as well. But the debate sort of continues, and I almost wish it would accelerate so that we could have some certainty to it, business-like certainty, and it accelerates business and investment and trade.
Okay. I'm not looking at all for political opinions or anything, but I am curious if you could explain to us in this conversation that may confuse some people that are not familiar with it about fast track, and why some, like the president and all sitting presidents, seem to want that authority to negotiate the free trade agreements. However, maybe people from the president's current party in big numbers are not necessarily in favor of that, where the opposition is. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, you bet, Tim. Fast track is also known as Trade Promotion Authority, or TPA. You'll see it referred to in all those ways in the press. The debate is this, that the fear is that there'll be a loss of sovereignty on our side and on the European side, but TPA is really a U.S. concept right now. If the president has authority to in essence require Congress to give an up or down vote on a final negotiated treaty. What's ironic about it is that we've had both Democratic and Republican presidents who've had TPA. The last TPA reauthorization was in 2002. It expired in 2007. And the political climate since then has been so polarized in Washington, D.C. that they haven't been able to agree on it again. And yet, as Kenny pointed out, on the treaty as a whole, TTIP as a whole, there are people on both sides of the aisle who want the president to have trade promotion authority, and there are those on both sides of the aisle who don't. There are some strange political bedfellows there. My view is that it doesn't take away from the democratic process. It's a conscious choice by our elected leaders, if they grant it to the president. It's a conscious choice by them to say, we understand that if we don't give the president this authority, then it'll be like making sausage, and that there will be, it essentially kills the ability of Congress to pass a major trade deal. Some minor ones have gotten through without it, but a major deal without TPA is almost impossible, because every congressperson, every senator is going to want their own angle on it. So I think it's a necessary thing, and I don't think it's undemocratic, because they can still vote it down. If they don't like the total deal with all its compromises, they can still vote it down.
So what's going on in Europe? Are they able to do fast track, or do they have to get it ratified by their countries?
Well, they'll have to get it ratified by the European Commission. I don't, I haven't actually looked into whether or not I haven't heard a debate going on in Europe about a fast track concept. So that's one I'll just have to check on. I don't think it's a major issue there.
The European Commission is my guess. That they've kind of handed it over to the European Commission in large part, correct?
Well, the trade commissioner, the European trade commissioner, reports to the European Commission. Okay. So she is an agent of the European Commission. But in terms of how the voting actually gets done, I want to check and see if that is a fast track mechanism in Europe.
So you were forecasting earlier some concerns about Putin and how this might affect this whole agreement, which he's not part of. Is it in relation to how European decides?
Yeah, I think it could affect TTIP in a positive way for two reasons. Number one, the U.S., in my view, oddly, has been a little reluctant to have an energy chapter, an energy section in TTIP. And there was discussion about that in early February during the 8th round of negotiations, and it was, the agreement was to talk about it later, which sounds like, either lawyers or politicians in a room, talking about, and they're probably both, quite frankly. But the way I think it could have an impact is energy security is a huge issue in Europe. We're now the number one country in the world for energy. It's less of an issue here for us now. I would think our government would want to be having an energy section in TTIP in order to be able to ship our LNG to Europe in a cost-effective way. But we're not seeing that yet. The reason I think it could be accelerated because of Putin's moves is what he's done so far in Ukraine and what we may be seeing in the Baltic states in the coming year could actually increase energy insecurity even more in Europe and drive Europe even closer to the U.S. in energy. And we would then have both a strategic and an economic reason to make that a key part of the agreement. The second broader reason is that, whether it's driven by energy considerations or not, I think, Europe's security historically has had a close tie to America's role. And I think you can think about TTIP as a kind of economic NATO. And I think whatever drives Europe closer to us will create an impetus for getting the trade deal done and could accelerate it. Whether it gets accelerated into this year, I'm not optimistic about, but it could get accelerated over like a 10-year process that the Trans-Pacific Partnership has gone through.
And just to reinforce that, when we're in the rooms with companies, particularly in Germany and those that are in the eastern part of Europe, it is a larger issue, and it is discussed almost every time. Russia's and the flow of gas is a topic of conversation. So it's a very practical thing to most of their small, mid-sized manufacturing companies and things like that.
Let's pull back the conversation to the local issues on connecting to the EU. Whether it's free trade agreements or increased access to new markets or whatnot, it seems to me that that creates an opportunity but not a guarantee. And that a lot of that requires companies and individuals, communities, to really focus in on developing their ability to take advantage of the opportunities. Namely, we need to develop a workforce and encourage companies that might not traditionally be seeking international sales to do so. And my experience working for the state of Ohio in export assistance has been that a lot of companies get drug into exporting because the potential international buyer finds them in the marketplace at an international trade show, which might be in Chicago, and says, I need to have your product. And I'll have a company maybe who manufactures potato chips jump through all these hoops to get a half a pallet of potato chips to Costa Rica. Is that really the right market for them? Later to learn that the U.S. government, state government, and local government have invested for years in an infrastructure to support exports. I'm curious on your views on, is that increasing? What's the challenge of getting more companies to engage in exports proactively rather than being drug in?
Well, Tim knows this better than anybody. He said it very well. We still only have about 2% of our companies that are exporting, and probably even less than that that are exporting to more than one country in the world. And
A country they didn't choose.
and a
That's
country
the
they
problem.
didn't choose. Maybe it was somebody who just, if you have a website, you can get a customer anywhere in the world. So a very practical thing for many of our companies is, having these agreements and understanding them leads them to maybe thinking a little bit more globally. We obviously, with what we've been on this stage before talking about with the Columbus Global Connect program, we believe that by growing trade and exports, every $1 billion we add to exports, we add between 4,000 and 5,000 jobs here in the region. And so we not only want them to export more for job growth, but it tends to lead them to be more innovative companies and more competitive companies overall, more sustainable, and they can weather storms a little bit better because they have a more diverse revenue base around the world. And that, just again, what that means is as you provide your product around the world and you're able to enter markets and you have these harmonization agreements that make that a little bit easier, that means that you're adjusting your product or your service constantly, and you're probably innovating and adding patents and things like that as you do that, making you a more competitive, more innovative company overall. And the evidence is there, the numbers are there, the big data is all fairly clear about these things. And so we're a proponent of helping our companies be competitive and get in their doors and help them do that. Things like the Ohio Export Internship Program are critically important to put people inside these companies, things like that. But again, these trade agreements are kind of fundamental to making this possible for those companies and make it a lot easier.
And I want to talk a little more about the export internship program because I care about it. But I do want to say in a few minutes we're going to move to audience questions. So please be thinking of yours. But let's do these final thoughts real quick. So the Ohio Export Internship Program is a partnership between the state of Ohio and the Fisher Business School at OSU. And now this year for the first time at Youngstown State University. This week they matched students that have been selected in the fall, trained this semester, which I'm part of, to the same number of companies. The last 3 years, we had 60 students from Ohio University, or Ohio State University, and actually other universities are allowed to apply for this program, matched with 60 companies. And the result from these companies was over $11 million of actual sales, reported by the companies. These are not sales interns. These are actual students that have been trained about the considerations for exporting, connected to a network of assistants. Many of these folks, you guys have been involved in this program, make themselves available to the students. And we also select the companies. So the companies are, they have to go through an application process, and part of what they have to convince the program is that they're going to utilize these interns to do more than they already do in the realms of exporting. Maybe export for the first time, pursue exporting, do market research, and it might be looking for that second market or the third market. And this is something that's unique because most internships, you just go to a company if you're a student to learn what they do. And this is one that actually is trying to nudge it forward. So hopefully that's something that we can all work together to invest in and increase, I think. But I do want to ask one final question here, Kenny, about something that I learned about recently. In February, Mayor Coleman's Job Expansion and Transportation Task Force, which was designed to maximize economic development around Port Columbus, recommended adding a direct flight to Europe, and that it could benefit our region of up to $50 million. What do you think would be ideal locations if we were able to set up a direct European flight?
Well, given that we have
Not for your vacation.
we want to be in a major hub, and we think that we have every advantage for those airlines. We have a great market. I mean, again, our market is, if you think about Ohio, it's the same size as Sweden, has a huge economy. So a flight to London would be fantastic. A flight to other international European hubs would also lead us to their markets and actually, again, just provide sort of that grease that makes international commerce work and adds to the productivity of the companies operating here or those European companies that are wanting to operate here or already are.
Are there similar U.S. markets that are similar to Columbus that are doing this now to Europe?
Sure, I think it's not a new strategy for growing markets, mid-tier markets like ours to want to have international service, and over time, some of them, as they've grown their economies, they've been successful with that. We're in a really good position because with a population of over 2 million inside, sitting in the middle of a big economy in the state of Ohio, and the Midwest is growing on a healthy basis now. I think we got every opportunity to make that case and be consistent about how we talk about it. It's really important to, again, to international commerce and the productivity of our companies.
Considering I just had to take 3 connecting flights, I would definitely be in favor of that.
Tim, I would add to that. I agree with Kenny that London probably makes the most sense, but as David Whitaker, who's here, knows, my own personal favorite would be Amsterdam.
I guess you're going to be here next week. So it is CMC's tradition. It is CMC's tradition to take audience questions. Please state your name and ask your question. We thank you in advance for avoiding long editorial comments. So please step right up.
See, I'm David Hanselman at the School of Environment and Natural Resources at OSU, and you all mentioned infrastructure. My question is the lack of attention in the U.S. and perhaps even in Ohio on infrastructure a bit of an Achilles heel where we could successfully negotiate an agreement but then not have a sustainable and efficient infrastructure to support trade overseas, be it in Europe or Asia and so on?
Well, it's interesting, the event I spoke of earlier, the Select USA Forum in Washington the last few days. There was a great panel yesterday led by Secretary Fox, Department of Transportation, and a number of CEOs talking about, again, continued investment in our infrastructure, both roads and bridges and airports, as well as digital infrastructure, again, as a is an opportunity to advance and to accelerate trade and investment. And the whole conference was around gaining international investors into the U.S. market. Without that infrastructure that is to a global standard, we have a hard time delivering, even though our infrastructure is as good or better than most places in the world. When it comes to comparing ourselves to European infrastructure, sometimes it's a really interesting conversation.
So through my work with the Ohio Export Internship Program and engaging with folks in that industry, I think we've invested quite a bit in the state and around this area, including the Heartland Corridor, so that we can directly go to a deep sea port, access the expansion of the Panama Canal. I think we've done a lot of improvements here in order to be competitive. I honestly feel like it's underutilized currently.
Probably true.
Yeah, I would agree, Tim. I think the Heartland Corridor is a great example because we have, since 2010, we've got double stack rail service to Norfolk, which is a much less congested port on the East Coast than New York, New Jersey, and that's a real benefit. Kenny and his team and others have really gotten the word out about that, but we can utilize it better. And I would take the questioners, I think it was a great question. I would take your question and flip it and say, yes, let's use TTIP and the prospect of elevated levels of trade with Europe as a further impetus to get our Congress to get their act together and pass long-term infrastructure bills, and to keep us and our community focused, in Ohio more broadly, to focus on alternative ways of funding infrastructure while Congress is still not on a long-term infrastructure track.
Just a great example of that is also our investments in Rickenbacker, our international air cargo hub right here in central Ohio that serves much of the Midwest, including all of Ohio. You have Cargolux exporting now 3 times a week, loading planes and taking cargo directly onto Europe. That's accelerating commerce and something that's well noted. When you talk to people, that's a big asset that we have. Continued investment in places like that is going to be critical if we're going to continue to accelerate and actually even maintain what we currently have.
I think for the benefit of educating both the students and potential exporters, Neil might approve a class that I'll propose to him where we send some students that actually can travel from Rickenbacker all the way through the system and kind of highlight what is there and maybe if there are challenges in that pipeline on what we need to address.
You're super persuasive.
Thought I had a good audience for that. Vanita.
Yeah, Vanita Mehra from the law firm of Kegler Brown. U.S. can learn from its experiences and mistakes. If this TTIP is passed, where can we take this model and use it next with which country? What can we do with this more way and beyond EU? So where are the opportunities to learn from the TTIP passage? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question, Vanita, and I'm not just saying that because we work together. But you raise a really important point because to flip it for just a moment, one of the criticisms of smaller multilateral trade deals as opposed to a fully global WTO process is that it results in trade diversion. That is, the countries that are involved in a regional trade deal, and this is essentially a regional trade deal between 2 very big regions, that they benefit. It doesn't necessarily increase global trade, it just diverts global trade into, between those 2 markets. That actually is a legitimate issue, but I look at it from 2 points of view. One is, if global trade is going to be diverted, I'd rather it be diverted to help us, quite frankly. And secondly, I think the studies, when you look at the broad array of studies in this area, they show that actually it's not just trade diversion. That what happens is businesses are really smart about finding efficient markets. And that's something we want to encourage. So back to your question, yes, I think, although TPP is coming first, it's already teed up, there will be other opportunities, whether it's other trade deals that involve countries in Asia that are not part of TPP. For example, China's not in that, not in the TPP, probably for political reasons. But Latin America and Europe, U.S. and a more broad set of multilateral trade deals with Latin America could be very helpful.
Thank you. Jane Scott with the Metropolitan Club. I actually have two things. One, I think I'm allowed to say this. We're teeing up for the German ambassador to be here at the Metropolitan Club on May 7, which is a special forum on a Thursday. So any of you who are interested in being there might want to mark your calendar. We haven't released that yet. And second of all, I'm naive about this. Are we replacing an agreement that's in place? Are we updating something? I mean, obviously, we're trading with the EU now. So what's different? What's happening that is different or new with this?
Yeah, we're not really replacing anything. Although there are some bilateral trade treaties within Europe that would then be captured within this. But the U.S. doesn't have a trade treaty in and of itself with the European Union, and that's what this is. So this will be new, and there are a couple of important aspects to it that Tim touched on in his opening remarks. One is market access, which involves two components. One is reducing tariffs, preferably to zero, but as you know, trade deals are compromises, so in some sectors, the tariffs might not go to zero. Tariffs have been dropping without a trade deal, but there are still some sectors where tariffs can be 7.5%, 8%, almost 10%. That's when you talk about companies' bottom lines, those are real numbers. They make a difference. And then the other is harmonization of regulations. That is potentially a really big benefit for our community here. So, quick example. In the automotive sector, there's a Dutch research firm that has looked at this, and they calculate that the different rules related to car safety in Europe versus the U.S., that those different rules are in effect a tax of about 26% on the respective auto industries in both Europe and here. So if we can harmonize regulations related to manufacturing of automobiles and commercial vehicles for that matter, we will save companies and consumers money.
The other thing with agriculture, if you look at it, in all the industries, most of them you hear about trade deficits that the United States carry. With agriculture, it's always been the opposite. We've had the surplus. Yet, Europe's one of the ones that we have the most non-tariff trade barriers with. The GMO issue, is it a scientifically based decision on their part not to import that? The U.S. agriculture mainstream would say no. So this is an opportunity for us to address those issues, even though it is a really open market for most products, I think. Kenny?
Go ahead.
Okay.
I'm Al Gobble. I'm professor emeritus at Ohio State. A lot of interest in economics. My preliminary question, have any of you visited the Rust Belt in northern Ohio? NAFTA has resulted in many small auto parts factories and other manufacturers of other merchandise to be moved to Mexico. And there are an awful lot of low-skilled workers up there that are destitute. I mean really destitute. They have no jobs. So the question is, will this proposal have any similar effect? And I know that TPP will. It's been characterized as NAFTA on steroids.
I'll respond just from, again, everyday experience that we have in working with the automotive supply chain and working with companies that are seeking to make investment, both those that operate here currently that are seeking to expand, as well as new automotive suppliers or even OEMs into North America. A lot of people are making a choice for Mexico right now. I think Toyota is the latest one to make a fairly major announcement just this week for additional investment in Mexico. A lot of that is not around talent or cost. A lot of that is actually around the trade agreements that Mexico has. I believe they have trade agreements with 22 or 23 additional countries beyond the U.S., and so it's just an easier location for them to export to around the world, and it provides a competitive advantage for them. And it really isn't about the things that it probably should be about, which is the great advantages of the U.S. market around people, technology, energy costs, those things that we have that are of great advantage. But a real issue, and that's why there needs to be dialogue and debate about these trade agreements, and they need to be fair and they need to be balanced, and they need to be enforceable over a period of time.
Tim, if I may add just real quickly to that, as both Kenny and I said earlier, trade deals do result in a net increase in jobs, but some jobs are dislocated, and some end up moving to Mexico, for example, as they did under NAFTA. Not as Ross Perot predicted; he was way off the mark. But we did lose some jobs, and the ones you mentioned are among them. On the other hand, if you look at that sector of the state, you can see a high increase in jobs related to polymers, and many of those are high-paying jobs. So we can try to protect the jobs we have now and not innovate toward the jobs of the future, but that's a dangerous strategy in my view in the long run. And then the last thing I'd note is not just NAFTA, but TTIP and many other trade deals have trade adjustment assistance programs in them, which primarily involve worker retraining schemes. So that I'm confident that will be an important part of TTIP.
So to illustrate that, actually with the Ohio Export Internship Program, one of my roles is to interview students, correct? So one of the students this year who's actually from Tiffin University, she's a non-traditional student, a little older, mom has 3 students, and she drives down every Friday from Tiffin, Ohio and back to participate in the Ohio Export Internship Program. The reason I selected her along with OSU's representative was because she said that she lost her job because of NAFTA. She was up in Northwest Ohio, she lost her job, and her immediate reaction was she's against globalization and free trade. It screwed her up, right? But she went back to college and she decided that she was going to be one of the people that brought jobs back as a worker. And that was by developing these skills. So immediately, she's going to be in my program, and I'm thinking if I ever run for Congress, she's going to be one of my spokespeople. But this is the thing we have to do. We can have these big opinions about things, but if it doesn't change individual actions, and OSU's doing something really cutting edge with the Ohio Export Internship Program. I know I sound like a broken record, but they're actually changing things. They're changing things for themselves and for those companies that we match them with, and they're engaging with this network of export assistance that we've invested in for years. So I want to encourage Ohio State and other universities to increase that. I think every business student should take an exporting focus kind of course. One more question, please.
My name is Chuck Lind, and I'm a chair of a coalition of groups that are working to improve the local economy. So it's a different lens that I view this, and before I ask my question, I want to reinforce that there are other views in terms of the net job loss from other sources indicate that in Ohio alone, we lost about 40,000 jobs to NAFTA and about 100,000 jobs to China. And we all know that we've made a transition from losing half our manufacturing base over the last 50 years to a largely service economy, which had a huge impact. But from the local point of view, if we're trying to develop innovation and improve the local food infrastructure, the local retail ownership, competing, and as well as investment in local business, local energy sources, local transportation, those are innovative things that are happening in the economy. And from what I hear, from our point of view, the global picture and these trade agreements are clearly favoring the multinational corporations, the larger corporations who can compete in this global system. That may be fine, but it's fine for them, and it's not necessarily, and that's why you're getting resistance from people who are opposing the fast track and who are looking at these trade agreements with great skepticism because they haven't impacted, from our point of view, they have a negative impact on the innovation that we want to see. So my question is, do you really feel that the larger systems that are going to benefit from these global trade agreements are going to be more innovative and ultimately better, or is it just a belief that that's going to happen? Because I don't think the facts bear it out.
I would tell you that the majority of our interaction with the business community, the companies that we're trying to assist in gaining access to international markets are largely SMEs. And those business owners that are entrepreneurs that are actually right here in our backyard that are trying to accelerate and diversify their revenue streams around the world. And they use things like the Export-Import Bank. They use any tool they can possibly get to help them do that. What they have a hard time dealing with at the big companies actually have infrastructure to sort of be patient with And they have lots of lawyers at Boeing and stuff like that to work through these agreements, right? But your company in Westerville or something, they really need the protection of the U.S. government, and they need the protection of these trade agreements maybe more than anybody. So there's some certainty, and it actually helps them do this quickly. If they're going to try to export into an international market, we don't want it to take them 3 years navigating all rules and paying, no offense, more time, but paying lawyers and stuff to navigate all of that.
I would disagree with that.
We want them to be able to do that with certainty over, a reasonable amount of time, 6 months or a year, where they can get their product in market, meet windows of opportunity that may exist around the world. Again, most of the people that we're working with are local companies that are literally small and medium-sized businesses trying to sell their services as well as their products around the world.
To me, this issue is about leadership. So when you're looking at the people that are may be disenfranchised a bit, it's because they might be employed from companies that are resistant investing into this area. So it kind of goes back to this idea that we've got to develop and adapt to the new opportunities, because things are always changing. So to me, that's part of it. I'm not saying that there's not two sides of this opinion, but what I will say is not enough people are involved in this discussion to really influence it positively.
And I'd like to just add quickly, I'm glad you raised that point. There are differing studies with different results. Let's engage about that. But you pointed out 100,000 jobs lost to China. I haven't seen that particular study. We don't have a free trade agreement with China, and yet we've still lost a bunch of jobs to China. The point is, there's more going on than just the free trade agreement. But I think we ought to engage on that. That's an important part of the debate. And I think we ought to remember that SME jobs are really important, but jobs with multinationals are too. Many of those are good paying jobs with great worker training programs, and there are a lot of benefits that flow from those jobs as well.
Well, I hope you all enjoyed today's forum. We encourage you to continue the conversation in the lobby over coffee and cookies. Remember that you can view and share this and all of our forums on CTV Columbus Television, on WOSU and PBS affiliates statewide through the Ohio Channel, and anytime you like on CMC's website via YouTube. Once more, let's thank the Ohio State University and the Columbus Regional Airport Authority for their support, and the Columbus Council on World Affairs for partnering. And thanks to our speakers, Tim Sword, Martine Steger, and Kenny McDonald. And thanks to all of you for being here. We look forward to seeing you at CMC again soon. Have a great afternoon.